folks, welcome back to Indaba Africa. This is Chris once again. Hello, folks. Welcome back once again to Indaba Africa. This is Chris coming to you live from central Pennsylvania, once again with another interesting guest today. And this is a gentleman who is a former member of the House of Lords in the United Kingdom, Lord Duncan McNair. He is a passionate campaigner for human rights. And we're going to talk about that topic today. So with that, no further ado, Duncan, how are you today? And how are things?
Well, I'm well, Chris, and thank you very much for having me on the show. It's a great honor. I must say, it's the first time I've broadcast to Africa, and so I'm all ready to go.
Well, actually, it's a global audience. Just a big portion of my audience are South Africans, but that's probably about half my audience. The rest comes from around the globe, including the United Kingdom, Ireland, Japan, China. I even have viewers in China, Australia, New Zealand, that sort of thing. Can we adjust your camera down slightly? Your chin is cut off just a little bit. Sorry about that.
How's that?
That's a lot better. Now, a little bit of top of your head's cut off, but that's fine. We got a good view there.
Well, if I move back a little bit.
No, that's perfect. Don't move. You're good right there. That's actually perfect. We got it centered. Thank you very much. That's an impressive looking library you've got behind you there. I've got kind of a short or soft spot for books. Quite an impressive bookshelf you've got behind you there.
Well, yeah, I have actually heard that people are buying up dictionaries for Zoom meetings, but the big blue books behind me just happen to be my grandfather's first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary from 1933. So they're actually genuine.
Now that's absolutely incredible. That's the sort of thing I love those sort of things. I have a book that's kind of a geography book, and also a gazetteer. It's kind of mixed, it's a combination of the two, from the 1860s or 1850s, 1858, I think it is, here, published here in the United States. It's amazing. It's like about this big, and it's just the way the binding is done, and it's just something I always go back to every few months and take a look at. Books are, I think, a precious commodity, and with the advent of electronic means and internet and all that these days, it seems like some people lose sight of that. We're losing that tactile touch of books in many respects because of e-readers and things like that. But also, people don't write anymore. Everything's typed, handwriting. I have terrible handwriting, so it's atrocious, but I do respect good penmanship, and I really think we're going to miss out on that. Ronald Reagan, of course, famously is one of the most recent political leaders that wrote often to people and has a vast history of his letters he wrote to people, personal notes and things like that. I think in future, we're just not going to see that from politicians and leaders. Not really our topic today, but I thought we'd just discuss this very quickly.
Well, can I just say one thing which ties in with that, and that is that I've got a lot of books on a lot of different subjects, some sort of very interesting political stuff and so on. But I've also got a few books, English language textbooks from the first half of the 20th century. And one in particular called The English Way, which is, it was a textbook for bankers, civil servants, accountants, that kind of person, professional people. And the English that they were expected to read and write would make your eyes water. And I would love to aspire to get back to that standard of English, because we have, you're right, we've lost that as well.
Well, absolutely. Of course, language always evolves and changes over time. I mean, if we try to read Old English, if we read Beowulf in its original form, that's a bit hard to follow. Now, I speak Germanic languages and English, English is Germanic language, but German, English, and Afrikaans. But, looking at Old English, I sit there and I'm guessing half the time what's being said. So language does change, but I'd have to agree with you. I think we've lost something from where we were maybe a century ago, and even just 50 years ago. The formality. I'm not saying that we should be rigid in our social mores and norms, but there's something to be said about the way that we converse, the way we interacted just 50, 60 years ago that seems to be missing today. And there's a degree of civility that was there. Even if it wasn't a civil world, in the language, there was a structure there, and it seems we're losing that. I hope that it's not a permanent thing. It's just a phase.
Well, in fact, you touch on something very germane to human rights with that, because I have another little book called The Conduct of Meetings, and it was written that edition was published in 1945, but it actually gives the ingredients of how you create bylaws for an organization. And one of the crucial things about democracy and democratic procedure is that you have an assembly and you always address another member in the third person. And in the American book, which I'm sure you've come across, is called Robert's Rules of Order.
Yes.
And that obviously was derived from British procedure preceding Colonel Robert. But the way that you always address meetings through the chair. I mean, in the House of Lords, we would say, would the noble lord, the so and so, and you address him like that. You see, now. That is not to say,
with the noble Lord McNair, please address this, like that.
Yes, exactly. That is not to say that you cannot knife somebody verbally.
Oh, well, yes, absolutely. People who are very good at prose and very good at insults, those things you've got to respect immensely. I love seeing that sort of thing when someone insults and just he leaves your entrails on the table, and they use the most proper of language.
Yes, absolutely. You don't need to shout and swear. In fact, it's much more effective not to.
Absolutely, and it's certainly more entertaining if you get the language.
Yeah.
One of my great joys, honestly, for you there, Duncan, is that when I was in high school, we had an English instructor when I was a junior in high school, my next to last year before I finished, and we studied English literature. But she had every week a vocabulary test with about 75 to 90 or 100 words that were words that most of us had never heard. I'm growing up in rural Appalachia, and these are words that you need to function as an adult. You mentioned one a few minutes ago, germane. I learned that in high school, what germane means. It's not one of the Jackson 5, that's someone else. Do you know germane? No, but my point is that that became passionate for me. I would never have been a big Scrabble fan or never have gone on, what's the clock show the UK has where you have to take the words and you have to the letters and form words. I forget the name of that one. You get the teapot, but I would never be big on that. But I fell in love with the English language, and I actually kind of dissed William Shakespeare in a long time because I didn't really enjoy some of his works. But as I got older in life, I really began to appreciate Shakespeare. He created whole cloth on his own, 20 to 30,000 different words and expressions in English language.
Really?
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing. So many things we still use today that are in common usage today are phrases or expressions that Shakespeare came up with in his writings, and we're just so used to saying it, we don't even know that it's a few centuries old. But English language is an amazingly adept language.
Well, the other source of our richness is actually the King James Bible, which was published in 1608. So it's more or less contemporaneous with Shakespeare, except it's a bit more thee and thou-ish. That both of those sources have made the English language really the language that it is today.
Well, there's one more piece to this, and those of us of Anglo-Saxon origin love to diss on the French. We love to give them a hard time. But of course, my 34th great-grandfather, both of them fought against each other. Harold Godwinson and William the Bastard, later William the Conqueror, came over from Normandy and fought at the Battle of Hastings. And of course, the French Norman that came over immensely enriched our language. As much as we don't want to admit it, that really had an impact. I mean, our language is so flexible. In French, if you want to say pig, if you want to say a type of meat, it's just one word, it's pork. But in English, we have swine, we have pig, we have pork, we have all these different words brought in from Scandinavian influences, from Anglo-Saxon and from Celtic, and well, nothing Celtic, but Celtic does affect the language, and also the French. So we're a very rich language. We incorporate words. Now, the only thing the French really did that messed our language up, from my perspective, is that this annoying habit in English is that many words we don't pronounce some of the letters, just like the French, which is very annoying if you're trying to learn English and it's not your first language.
Oh, it is indeed, yes.
German or Swahili, very easy. It's phonetic. You see it, you say it the way you're supposed to, but that's not the case in English, which throws people off. But anyway, we could have this discussion forever. We could talk about Melvin Bragg and his stuff on English language. It'd be fun. But let's get into a little discussion about yourself so people know a little bit about your boni fides, who you are. You're not just some oak that rocked up here for a conversation. You actually have a vast experience, as does your family, in this conquest, this struggle for human rights and ensuring that people are familiar with what their human rights are. Somebody just gave a super chat. Thank you, Brett, for that $10 super chat. I'll get to that in a moment. But a little bit about yourself. You were previously a member of the House of Lords. You served there, I believe, for about a decade back in the 1990s. And can you tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe your upbringing and how you got to where you are in the world today, just so that people have an appreciation for who you are, Duncan?
Well, my grandfather was a prominent international lawyer, and he is actually the reason why I'm involved in human rights at the moment. And I have a great deal to be thankful to him for. He was actually the British judge at the International Court of Justice at The Hague in Holland. Now, the International Court of Justice is where countries take each other to court on civil matters. So, for example, Chile and Argentina were having a wrangle about where the border was along the Andes. And so they went to the International Court of Justice to mediate. But it also gets involved in more dramatic things. And in 1952, he was the British judge from 1946 to 1955. And in 1952, the Iranian government had been trying to negotiate with a company that became British Petroleum for a decent share of the oil revenue, which they thought they owned at the northern end of the Persian Gulf. And so what Mohammad Mossadegh, who was the Iranian prime minister, was trying to do was simply to get a decent share of the oil revenue. There's nothing revolutionary about it, but attitudes in those days were pretty fixed. And so in the end, he got thoroughly frustrated and his government nationalized the oil. Well, I mean, this was for the British, this was the end of civilization as we know it. And so they brought a case which would have been heard at the International Court of Justice to try and get their oil assets back. And what happened was that my grandfather was very keen on states' rights vis-a-vis other states. And so he encouraged his colleagues to the view that actually, he supported the Iranian view. And the reasoning was, well, it's a company and not a country that's lost its assets. And so the court decided by a majority that it couldn't hear the case. Because if it's a company, then it has to go somewhere else. And so what happened then was that the British and the Americans got together, the CIA and MI6, and they organized a coup and overthrew the elected prime minister. In fact, Iran had an elected government, a democratic government, since 1906. And anyway, I had a friend in London who was from Iran. Actually, he was a member of the Baha'i faith himself, and he introduced me to the man who'd been that prime minister's private secretary, a gentleman called Ali Reza Saheb. And he told me that my grandfather had been a national hero at the time, and that if he'd been able to be, if he'd been invited back to, or invited to Tehran, capital of Iran, and managed to negotiate a deal, then the whole history of the Middle East could have been different since then. I mean, imagine Iran still being a democratic government.
Well, this, of course, would mean that the Shah, of course, never rose to power in the early 1950s. Completely different history.
Well, yeah, and beyond the Shah, of course, the current regime.
Well, of course, but what I mean is the Shah begat this regime. I mean, that's
it was this regime was the swing of the pendulum against the Shah, really, wasn't it?
Exactly. Just like George Bush is the repulsion against Clinton, and then Barack Obama's repulsion against George Bush, and Donald Trump's repulsion. Here we're swinging back and forth. That pendulum goes way over here and way over here. But yeah, that was my point, is that society, that response was because of the Shah. If he had never come to power, the history might have been very, very different. Absolutely. So that seems like quite a proud heritage to be something that you can hang your hat on there. But let's jump forward a little bit. Your experience in life. What, were you doing something before you went into Parliament? Obviously, you must have been doing something.
Well, yes. I mean, I had a small business, which was nothing to do with Parliament. I wasn't anticipating inheriting my title for a long time, but my father was actually killed in a car accident.
Shame.
So I was sort of bounced into the choice, the opportunity. Am I going to go and take my seat in the House of Lords? Because I didn't have to. But then I thought, well, it could be interesting. So I had to feel my way because I hadn't ever done anything in public life before. But I found my feet, and I think I had quite some adventures with some of the things that I was involved in, and then of course it all came to an end in 1999. It was Tony Blair just decided that. Well, I say that I took my seat in 1990, and in 1999 Tony Blair took it away.
Okay. Well, that's well. This was an interesting time. I mean, historically, let's just reflect on a few things. First, that was a difficult transition period for the United Kingdom at the end of the Cold War. The collieries were shutting down. The coal industry was dying in Wales and elsewhere, and having a big impact on the British economy. A lot of corporations were snatched up by German. We saw Rover was snatched up by BMW, and we saw other manufacturing businesses snatched up by Japanese companies and others, and a lot of that production shipped offshore. And it was a very difficult time. John Major was prime minister. Who? John Major? Do we remember him? I don't know. Not a very consequential time period is the reason why I mentioned that. I'm not dissing on John Major, but my point is that most people don't remember that guy was prime minister. A lot happened. And then, of course, and shifting this, it's a nice segue here to the human rights aspect. We see some pretty horrific human rights abuses taking place at the end of the Cold War in the Balkans, in Bosnia. There were 50,000 children born as a consequence of rape in Bosnia-Herzegovina alone.
Really? Was 50,000.
50,000. Yes, I know. I was deployed to the Balkans. I was an intelligence analyst. I reported on it and warned people about the dangers when Croatia and Slovenia talked about independence, what was going to come. And sadly, I was correct. And then foolishly, Izetbegovic and Bosnia had a plebiscite, and they voted for independence, which just meant the whole thing fell apart. But in Bosnia alone, there were 50,000 children, and these children are, as you can imagine, to this day, we're talking nearly 30 years later in many cases. Almost 30 years old. They're widely discriminated against. They're shunned. It's really sad, really horrific what happened here. They rounded up women and put them in houses, and these militias came through and gang raped them. That was their recreation, and a lot of terrible things happened. And we're talking about grandmothers and prepubescent. It was really sick. So we saw these horrific human rights abuses in the Balkans, which raised some attention, and then this right to protect came about, and excuse me, am I getting the right word here? That they came up with the responsibility to protect, I think as they call it. I call it the right to protect. I actually came with RTP before Samantha Powers and all these other folks came with it.
Is the right to protect, is that the international initiative?
Yeah, they call it the responsibility to protect. I call it the right to protect. And that's there is a time in my view. Now, as a small government and conservative person, I'm kind of odd in this situation. I think that there are situations that are so egregious that when an actor is out of the international norms, that their sovereignty, they've abridged their sovereignty. I believe in state sovereign rights. And you mentioned International Court of Justice. We can come back to it a little bit later on. But there are cases like in Rwanda when I think it's the responsibility of the international community to intervene to stop the slaughter of people. And we should have done that. Now, many people disagree with me, particularly generals in my military. But, the proof of the pudding is this. In Sierra Leone, we saw an absolutely horrific civil war that took place for nigh on a decade in which they were chopping and lopping hands off, cutting lips off of people. Really horrific things, drugging up children, having them rape their own parents and then execute them. And this war ended in 3 weeks with a rifle battalion minus of British troops deployed to Sierra Leone. And in 3 weeks, the war was over. When we sent troops off the coast of Liberia, didn't even land in Liberia except at the American Embassy compound, never ventured outside it. Liberia's 13-year civil war ended almost instantaneously. Now, to be fair, both those conflicts kind of burned themselves out. But my point is that there are times when it's appropriate to intervene. I was an advocate for intervening in the Balkans, and we didn't until 95. By then, the carnage was too great. I was an advocate. I was actually about to board a plane to fly to Rwanda in Frankfurt when I was called back, and we canceled that mission to go stop the carnage in Rwanda. It just stopped. That's a little-known story about 1994. And then, of course, we see it go on in the Congo, what happens, the human rights abuses there. The list goes on. And I don't want to just restrict this to Africa. Okay? We talk about the Balkans. Yeah, we could talk about the Rohingya, the Uyghurs. We could talk about Black Americans in America's past. The list is endless. But when a majority uses a facade of government or democracy to oppress a minority and do this sort of thing, it's really sad. And that's a long-winded thing, and I opened up a lot of windows there. So if you want to go in a direction with anything I just talked about, feel free to do it.
Yeah, well, my contacts through the human rights work are Well, basically, I have a course on my website which is translated into Arabic, Turkish, Kurdish, Farsi, and Urdu. So that gives me quite a lot of scope. And we started off with Farsi speakers because of the connection with Iran. We did about 170 workshops in 10 or 15 series groups. And then what I did was I started attending meetings in Parliament where members of those language communities were addressing or having their issues addressed. And so that the two groups that I'm most in contact with now are the Urdu speakers, and of course the Kashmir issue is a running sore, terrible situation. But also in terms of the right to protect, when we finally saw what Saddam Hussein was doing to the Kurds, and before that, I think there was the no-fly zone in the south when he was draining the marshes.
Yes.
But the things that Saddam Hussein was doing to the Kurds, they're not something you would really talk about on the air. He managed to buy some poison gas, thoughtfully supplied by a German chemical company, but don't get me on that.
It is a matter of record, so don't sweat that.
Yeah, right. So the no-fly zone in the Kurdish region actually led to the Kurds being the only group of the four national minorities of the Kurdish people who have some kind of
self-governance.
Self-governance autonomy. And actually, I'm working very closely with them. And just to bring it right up to the moment, I'm hoping that I can arrange to actually travel to Erbil, which is the capital of Kurdistan in Iraq, in not many days. I've got a trip to Azerbaijan coming up in the middle of February. But in Kurdistan, I'm quite far on with discussing and planning a schools project that would go on for about 8 months. It's quite a major pilot, and so I'm very excited about that, because that would really launch Peaceful Planet as a force for good, and that's really what I want it to be.
Now, we're going to talk about Peaceful Planet and some other things here. We'll get back to the International Court of Justice and the responsibility to protect, which is what the international community is driving for. Like I said, I call it the right to protect. I think that states should have the right to when a state abrogates its right. But let's unpack this a little bit right here. The concept of human rights, and let's discuss that for our audience very quickly, or maybe not quickly, maybe in depth, but the concept of human rights. Here in America, of course, out of a British legal tradition and other traditions, we have this concept of inalienable rights, God-given rights that we believe are enshrined, and they're just natural rights. And that's not, we derive that from great philosophers, but it's something that our founding fathers put into place and put pen to paper to enshrine it. It's under threat every day now, but it's there. So that's one thing. And in there, of course, those are things that would be considered human rights. But there is an International Declaration of Human Rights that countries around the world have signed, and many, many different things are in there. And many actors call many things human rights. And let me just tell you an anecdotal story to give you an idea why I'm mentioning this. So I was in Liberia, and there was a Zambian nurse who was a colonel, and she was with the United Nations mission in Liberia when we were rebuilding Liberia. I didn't have a lot of resources to focus on certain things that I thought were very important. One of those was to take recruits and to teach them about the hazards of, when you're not careful sexually, your sexual activity, HIV in particular, but also sexually transmitted infections. So, that's just something you do with the military. You have troops come in, recruits, you tell them about these things so they can behave properly and protect themselves and their partners. So I asked her to come in, and she was happy to do it. And after it was over, she spoke to 500 recruits in a big hall that we had and talked to them about it. and a very difficult subject, of course, HIV. But after it was over, we had lunch and we were chatting, and she said to me, she said, "I was very nervous about coming and doing this for you, Colonel White." And I said, "Why is that, ma'am?" She said, "Well, because, the problem with the Americans is that you people violate human rights." And I was like, "Oh, here we go. Here we go. This is going to be all about Abu Ghraib. This is up. I see it coming. Oh, gosh, I don't want to talk about Abu Ghraib." Anyway, so it wasn't about Abu Ghraib. It wasn't that. She was talking about HIV. She said, your military forces your soldiers to get tested, and that's a violation of human rights. And I said, "I'm sorry? A violation of human rights? How is it a violation of human rights?" "Well, people have a right to privacy." So this is where the conversation went, and that's why I want to bring this up with you. The right to privacy, in my view, is not a human right. That's a privilege, and it's the one that's conferred. Now, certain states in their constitutions and laws enshrine it, others don't. So in our country, we do sort of have that kind of enshrined in our law. But the right to privacy, and in this case in particular, and this is the argument I made to her, she understood it, but she didn't agree with it, so we had a different opinion. I said, "Listen, when we send our troops abroad, or even domestically, to do something, to put out a fire or respond to a natural disaster, or God forbid, be involved in combat somewhere, we have a responsibility to do as little harm as possible. We are bringing lethal force, and our responsibility is to inflict as little damage as possible to accomplish the mission." Now, a lot of people out of uniform think that's crazy, but that's actually what we're supposed to do, and we actually train to minimize that. And it may seem strange when you see, drones and bombs flying things, but honestly, that is a key component, and that is a core consideration, at least in our military and many developed militaries. And I told her, I said, "Listen, how can we responsibly send our soldiers abroad who are HIV positive to remote, austere environments in which they're under constant stress, poor sleep, poor diet, and they're always in jeopardy, or things like that are happening, and we don't have proper medical facilities there to treat them?" And this is, of course, many years ago, before the advancement of antiretrovirals, which were already out there, but they were very toxic. I said, our first responsibility is to the soldier, sailor, Marine. If they are infected with something that's deadly, we shouldn't be sending them abroad where they can't get proper care. That's the first thing. Second, listen, you can dance around this all day wherever you want, but when soldiers, sailors, and Marines go abroad, let's be honest, people are people, and humans are creatures, and they get involved with people and have relations. And the last thing we want to do is take an infectious disease and propagate it in a society abroad when we're doing a peacekeeping mission or we're doing a humanitarian assistance mission. So we have a responsibility to that population, that civil population there. So she listened to my argument and she said, "Yeah, but you still commit human rights abuses." But because we tested our soldiers, and I told her, I said, "Listen, our soldiers, the only person that knows their status is the physician who gets the result, the soldier, and their unit commander. No one else is allowed to know. No one can know their status. So if you're HIV positive military, no one else can know. And if someone finds out or they disclose it, they get criminally punished for that sort of thing in the military." So I said, it's between, when it first came about, we were discharging soldiers. Now, I thought that was unjust back in the 1980s, but we modified that policy a few years later, and we allow soldiers who are HIV positive remain on active duty. We just didn't let them deploy abroad, and we test them. So she didn't disagree. Anyway, the reason I unpacked that whole story, Duncan, is just to get some thoughts about human rights, what they are, what they're not, because reasonable people will disagree on what a human right is, but there are, I think, some core human rights that we can all agree, this is a human right. You are born with these natural rights. You come out of the womb and you are entitled to these things. They are natural. So any thoughts? I'm sure you got tons of thoughts on that soliloquy there.
Recently, and I got to follow this up, I read that the origin of the Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence philosophy was from Anglo-Saxon, from Germany in almost prehistory, where they had evolved a democratic structure for their tribes, and the whole idea of common law comes from that origin. Now, there's a very interesting thing. I'm not really answering your question because I'm going back way before, but you see, the Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence ties in with the Jeffersonian idea that the state exists to serve the individual, and this, you can trace this back to King John and the Great Charter, or we call it the Magna Carta, and you can also go even further back to Cyrus the Great. And Cyrus the Great, in I think it was 538 BC, conquered Babylon, and he said that everyone could worship the way that they wanted to worship and that all slaves were free. And the only reason we know that is because we found one instance of a clay cylinder, which, although it's slightly damaged, it has his declaration on it. And anyway, bring this further forward. So we have the Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence linked with the Jeffersonian idea of the state existing to serve the individual. Now, if you go to Europe, continental Europe, you find that they have what's a legal system which is broadly based on the Napoleonic Code.
Which is the opposite concept.
Well, yes. In a French court, you have to extricate yourself from the accusation. Now, the idea that we are innocent until proved guilty comes from Sir William Garrow, who was a very prominent lawyer and I think judge in the 18th century in England, and that he came up with that idea. Of course, until you are judged guilty, you cannot be considered guilty. But that does, if you actually committed the crime, then of course, morally and legally you are guilty. But the whole process of the court is to establish that. And the underlying philosophy of the continental jurisprudence is much more, in contrast to the Jeffersonian idea, is much more linked to the Hegelian philosophy that the individual exists to serve the state.
Friedrich Hegel, we're talking about there.
Yes. Friedrich Hegel. So this is manifested in the difference between the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the European Convention on Human Rights. Because if you compare the two documents side by side, you will find that the European Convention is much more government friendly, and the Universal Declaration is much more people friendly. And in fact, my grandfather, Sir Arnold McNair, as he was at the time, he didn't have a role in drafting the European Convention on Human Rights, but once it had been agreed, he campaigned, that was in 1950, he campaigned for a court to uphold the convention. And so when the court actually started its work in 1959, so that we're talking 9 years later, he was the founding judge. He was the president of the court, the founding president. And so there's been a number of judgments that the court has handed down, which I'm very proud of him for, not just him, but the course that he set for the court. And so I think that the Anglo-Saxon jurisprudence is something that we have to treasure. It is, we need to hold fast to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And your president, which was the president who had the four freedoms?
Oh,
your president. Was it Roosevelt?
No, I think you're talking about Wilson.
No. Wilson was First World War. This was during the Second World War.
Oh, that was Franklin Roosevelt during the Second World War. Sorry.
And of course, his wife and widow, Eleanor Roosevelt.
Well, she was the real proponent. I mean, he was. My personal view of him is a bit of a bigot and a racist, but I don't really think that he was the champion that people make him out to be. Eleanor Roosevelt was a great humanitarian, a great civil rights advocate, and she was a driving force behind what he came up with there.
Maybe she even wrote his Four Freedoms speech.
She probably did. No, seriously, look, I mean, I have no love lost for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was an elitist, privileged person who looked down with disdain on people, and history has remembered him far too kindly, in my view. But his wife was an amazing woman, and she was a real champion of civil rights. It's kind of like during the Kennedy administration in Camelot, the talk was that Jack Kennedy was a great civil rights advocate. No, he wasn't. It was Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy, his brother's attorney general, pushed for civil rights. He's the great person who made the, well, I mean, not that Jack Kennedy's not a great person, but Bobby Kennedy is the one who made great strides towards improving the quality of life for all Americans. So, sometimes history doesn't quite get it right, but as a historian, I like to expose the truth.
Well, yes, and Bobby Kennedy's son is now doing a very, very important work in exposing some of the stuff that we're confronting at the moment.
Absolutely. And that's unfortunately a topic we can't spend a lot of time talking about because it will get censored on this platform, shut down.
Yeah, exactly.
So speaking of human rights and free speech, but to be fair, that's a private corporation, and our free speech is protected by intrusion by the government, not by private corporations. What the private corporation does is abuse and violation of terms and contracts. So that's contract law. But anyway, so just for the audience, for people, because if PooTube, as I affectionately call it, or Twitter shuts you down, that's a civil lawsuit. That's not a civil rights issue and a human rights issue. When the government does it to you, like they do in the land of Oz, down under right now, that's a human rights violation. Duncan shook his head. I think we're in agreement on that one.
Well, yeah, no, I nodded. Yeah.
Sorry, nodded.
I think it's Greece where they do it the other way around.
Okay.
They nod for no and shake for yes. I believe I'm right in saying.
Okay. All right. So you disagree, or?
No, I completely agree. Okay. Yes. I think we're basically on the same page as far as all that stuff is concerned.
No, absolutely. Well, there will be points of difference. You and I would disagree on a few things. I'm pretty certain of that. Look, just for the audience's edification, Lord McNair and I know each other from an event we attended about 2.5 years ago in London. We both went there and participated in an event that was organized by a colleague of mine, and it was an interesting event. Unfortunately, the time got collapsed, and we had to jam things together, and so I think it could have been a lot more productive, but it was interesting. That's when we first became acquainted with each other, and we've been in touch since then. And so I thought this would be an apropos topic to talk about, particularly with all the bizarre machinations occurring around the world with human liberty. I mean, in Australia, where a woman who has been in a building where someone turned up positive, they come to our house. Yes. Come with us. Where? To the concentration camp in the Northern Territories. Well, they don't call it concentration camp, but let's come here. Yeah, but I'm self-isolating. No, you must come with us. I don't consent. Well, we'll fine you 5,000 Australian dollars and we'll arrest you for failure to comply with a lawful order. Okay, I'll go. She goes, she spends 3 weeks there, never tests positive for this affliction. The whole time she's there, she's given abysmal meals once a day. She continually asks, why am I here? I want to go home. And they threaten to sedate her if she doesn't shut up. She returns home after 3 weeks, having never been afflicted with this ailment, and has lost her job and is destitute now. And the world doesn't seem to care. Anyway, so I digress.
Well, I mean, yes, there are an awful lot of things that shouldn't happen that have been happening. Now, there's an interesting human right, which I'm very keen on. One of the Universal Declaration is Article 27. And Article 27 has two parts. The second part is about your right to protect your intellectual property, which is fine. The first part is that we have the right to share in and participate in the arts and culture, and also to benefit from advancements in scientific research. Now, in the years, well, I mean, for all the years of the 20th century, there's been huge suppression of natural health. And my personal favorite is oxygen medicine. And in fact, I'm not sure whether I can go into this on this program, but there was an individual who had such an impact on the 20th century in the interests of strengthening his own business empire, that we have a very different world to the world that we would have had if he hadn't existed.
For the better or worse?
We would have a better world.
Oh.
I mean, John D. Rockefeller hijacked medical education, and he also hijacked general education. I mean, it's a pretty specialist thing, so I won't really go into it. But sure. On my website, in my dedication to my grandfather, I say that we swim in the river of history, and the quality of the water that we swim in is depends on what has flowed into the water upstream. In other words, in previous years. So people like the individual that I mentioned, who funded the Nazi Party and did all sorts of things, have polluted the water of the river of history. And people like my grandfather, who have sought to improve people's lives and the legal environment and so on, they have improved the quality. And so what I'm trying to do with Peaceful Planet is to flow some good, wholesome water into that river of history.
No, absolutely. Well, it's interesting you mentioned it. There was just, I don't know if it's happenstance or just the way things develop, but in the 1990s and in the aught decade, in the early part of this century, there were a number of books written by researchers and academics on topics. A great one was about salt and how history was affected by salt and human settlement and those things. And it's fascinating to read it. As a historian, I'm fascinated, but I mean, just as a general layperson, you think people find it fascinating. But there's a really good book about oxygen, and not to get into the topic, about what oxygen is, the molecule itself, and what impact it has. And I bought that book. It's kind of like you'd think it'd be a science book, but it was really written from a standpoint that the average layperson could really get to understand the impact of oxygen and what it means to life and what it doesn't mean. So anyway, not to digress, but
well, no, I actually, Chris, that is a subject, as I mentioned, it's a subject of great fascination for me. Did you know? This has nothing to do with human rights.
Yeah.
But did you know that when the world was new, apologies to any creationists, but when the world was new, there was no oxygen in the atmosphere.
Correct. Yes. Yes, I know that. Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's news to a lot of people, and the only way that we got oxygen is because the first inhabitants of the planet had a reverse way of metabolizing. They took in carbon dioxide and they gave out oxygen.
And the byproduct was oxygen, yes. And then we actually went up with much greater abundance of oxygen in periods in our history of the past than we currently have in our atmosphere.
Well, that's one issue. But the thing is that the planet's crust absorbed oxygen up to the point where it couldn't. So when you go to mine iron, you don't mine a lump of iron, you mine an oxide of iron.
Fair point.
So when there was no more possibility of the Earth's crust absorbing oxygen, it then accumulated in the atmosphere. And what that did was, I don't know the full science of it, but what that made possible was the appearance of multicellular creatures. And so the whole of evolution results from the fact that oxygen developed in the atmosphere. And so really, I'm a great proponent of natural health. So to talk about alternative medicine is a bit rich, because everything really is alternative to oxygen.
Interesting. Of course, with a lot of time in Africa, one thing I spent a lot of time looking at, and when I was a university undergrad and graduate, also researches a lot, is traditional medicine and what people use, herbs and things like that, and plants. In the Western Cape and in South Africa, there's a vast treasure trove of medicinal plants out there that many people are completely unfamiliar with, and they have a great potential there. But not to get into that conversation, but this is an interesting digression here. I enjoy this, but let me just let people know that folks are listening to Chris White Africa on the Indaba Africa channel, part of the Indaba Broadcasting Network. My special featured guest today is none other than Lord Duncan McNair, former member of the House of Lords and the founder of Peaceful Planet. We're going to talk about that here shortly. He is a tireless campaigner for human rights, and we're actually discussing what exactly human rights are and the tradition of human rights. And he has a very strong interest and tie back to Persia and Iran. We've talked about that with his grandfather and others going back in the past, involved with that. Plus, this, going back in history, mentioning Cyrus the Great. That's going way back there. That's definitely some Persian history there. But we'll talk a bit more about this. We'll mention some other organizations. We'll get back to this concept of responsibility to protect. But let me just shift right now, Duncan, a little bit. There are a lot of organizations, that the international organizations, non-government organizations, and organs of international bodies that are focused on human rights. We've got the International Committee of the Red Cross, based in Geneva, which that's an aspect of to what they do. Human Rights Watch, based in Manhattan, New York. We've also got Amnesty International, Reporters Without Borders. While their primary mission is in human rights, a lot of what they do exposes human rights abuses, especially when it limits freedom of the press and speech. And there are many other organs. The United Nations High Commissioner for the Human Rights Commission, United Nations Human Rights Commission, a lot of organs out there, and yet we see so many human rights abrogated, violated, obliterated, and it's all over the planet. It's not restricted to one region or one continent. It's in Europe, it's in the Americas, it's in Asia, it's in Africa. I don't want to sound like the world's hopeless, but boy, Homo sapiens can be really nasty creatures at times, can't they?
Well, yes, and I wish I had with me the very famous quote from Eleanor Roosevelt, which she delivered as part of her speech in the 10th anniversary celebration in 1958. But going back to 1948, the idea was that human rights, those human rights, should be taught in all schools everywhere. And it's fairly clear that we haven't been doing that, and that if we had, the world could be a very different place. Now, my pitch in wanting to work with governments to bring in human rights education in schools is it's based on the idea of generational change. Now, I'm quite a bit older than you are, Chris, and when I was starting my adult life in the 1970s. We were the first generation that became really concerned about the environment, and we campaigned about it, and we talked to our children, and all that kind of thing, and then the children sort of started learning about it in school, and 2 generations on, we've had the Millennium Development Goals, we've got the Sustainable Development Goals. And I know that, in my view, this agenda has been hijacked by some rather unsavory people. But basically, you could not now go back to the ideas or the attitude that you had to the environment in the 1960s and 1970. So my idea of generational change applies. I use that analogy to how I see the future for human rights. And I mean, to get good environmental practice in the 1960s seemed an impossibility. There's a local journalist who campaigned, in the environment seemed an impossibility. There was a time when it wasn't known that asbestos was incredibly dangerous. And there's a chap who was I think he was the environment correspondent of the Observer newspaper. And it took him 25 years to get acceptance for the fact that 25 years on, people who worked with asbestos were liable to develop horrendous lung diseases. So my idea is that in 2 generations, we will have 2 generations of human rights education. We will have a very different kind of a planet. And so, yes, there are horrendous violations of human rights. But if you think about it, all the people who are running things at the moment are people who grew up before human rights were even being talked about.
That's fair. It's a fair point. Yeah, go ahead.
So, that's what I'm pushing. Mm-hmm. And we have actually got a complete program of human rights education on the website. I have written, and a local person has illustrated a little booklet for children, and we have an educator guide to deliver that mm-hmm. for elementary school children. And I've also written a post-secondary course, and I have from Youth for Human Rights International, I have the secondary school course, which is the one that's already been translated. And I'm now going through a whole process of getting them translated, getting the other courses translated. But I have actually got people helping me, and the Urdu course and website are being translated at the moment. And I've got somebody some people who are going to be translating the whole website into Kurdish and Arabic. And that will then open up the whole possibility of me going to North Africa and the Middle East and the Gulf. That's actually my big push at the moment. But I think we can. I don't think we can't just sort of say, oh, it's the governments.
No.
Because Chris, you look at it this way: if my best protection for my rights is that you know what they are, and your best protection is that I know what those same rights are. Mm-hmm. So if we approach it in that way, where every right is also a responsibility, then that actually makes a very strong connection. And that is actually the connection between human beings. The rights actually come from the preamble to the Universal Declaration. And you mentioned a lot of organizations. A lot of organizations are actually educating about the human rights, mm-hmm. but an enormous amount of human rights education is just about human rights in general, and then swerves off into violations. But if you think about it, this need for human dignity is a reflection of the Golden Rule.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And each of those rights is a specific example of how the Golden Rule can be either violated or correctly interpreted and operated. So it's very important when you study the Universal Declaration to look at this. Everything comes from the human dignity, the need for human dignity. There's actually an academic at Harvard. I wish I should have made a note before we talk, but she has built her whole career just on this one aspect of human dignity, and she does conflict resolution, and she does workshops in industry and so on. And but this is actually where it all starts from.
Well, that's a lot for me to unpack. Let me make a couple comments to address it very quickly. First off, there's some really nice comments coming in from the chat. People complimenting the conversation, also your background and the thoughts you're sharing. So thank you to the audience. My apologies for not getting more chat in there, but we're obviously very deeply engaged in this. But let me respond and raise a few points about that. First off, Duncan, thank you kindly for mentioning my youth. I do appreciate that. That's very kind of you. That's it's always nice to be reminded of that, but thank you. No, but seriously, you mentioned it. Your generation was the generation that really started to address things like, the harm that people do to our planet, and that's where you're going with that. Earth Day came about in 1970. That's kind of, I think, the time frame you're talking about, maybe the 60s, early 70s. Well, I was one of those young kids, maybe one of your kids that time, that was deeply influenced by this. But I went a direction a bit different than many folks did. I became a conservationist, not an environmentalist. A big distinction there, obviously, being from my perspective, is that the planet is here and we're welcome to use it responsibly and renew it. So replanting things, refreshing soil, replenishing soil, not being rapacious. That's where I come from. That's the worldview I have. But it was influenced very much by your generation and by people making those events happen. I remember the 1970s writing to the Environmental Protection Agency, which was a relatively new agency, and getting free information sent to me about the dangers of polychlorinated biphenyls and polybromated biphenyls, these chemical products that go into electric transformers and other industrial products, and our tissues can't break it down, and it's horrific in our body. We absorb it through food and water, ingesting it. Love Canal, the Cuyahoga River catching on fire, all these different things, strip mining, all of these things taking place. And I saw as a young man, because of what you've referred to, this generational change in education, we began to change the tide. America's air today is cleaner than it's been in over a century at any point. Our water, with the exception of Flint, Michigan, famously, is cleaner than it's ever been in many aspects. But that doesn't mean we don't have problems. But a lot of that's come about because of the environmental awareness, but also because of conservationists who've sought to renew things. In fact, the forest cover in the northeast of the United States is greater today than when Europeans arrived.
Really?
In the first 3 decades after Europeans arrived, they clear-cut trees in Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New York, places like that, and they wiped out entire groves of ancient growth. That's all back, and mostly because those states aren't agricultural centers. Of course, a lot of the people came and settled in North America, came to be farmers and scratch out a living, subsistence, and so they cleared the forest and things like that. But we don't by and large, don't have as much agriculture in those places. So we have a larger white-tailed deer population now than we've ever had in our history. It fluctuates between 30 and 50 million deer, depending on how successful they breed each year. That's despite the fact that tens of thousands are killed in automobile accidents every year because they hit across highways. But my point is that we actually have more forestry cover now without any intentional effort to do it, just because of happenstance. But anyway, my point is that the efforts that your generation and others made influence folks like myself. But I look around today and I want to cry. I mean, the sloth and laziness of people, and it's not just here. When I lived in Tunisia, you know what we called the national bird of Tunisia? We had a name for it in French. Take a guess what the national bird of Tunisia is. It's not a falcon, but take a guess. Any idea?
I have. Were you asking me or asking the chat?
No, I'm asking you. It's just I'm having a go.
No,
here.
no, I have no idea. I have no idea.
Okay.
Tell me.
All right. Well, we call le sac plastique, the plastic sack. Because 20 plus years ago when I was based in Tunisia and attended L'École d'État-Major, the staff college there, everywhere we went, the fields were full of plastic sacks. There were so many of them that they tilled the soil. You could see part of it sticking out, and they didn't bother to pick it up because people just tossed their rubbish out the door. And that's all over the world. I mean, it's heartbreaking for me to see rubbish on the side of the motorway when I drive from London to Manchester, and I see rubbish on the side of the roadway. And it's even worse here in Pennsylvania. I pick up cans when I go out walking and hiking, and I collected 250,000 aluminum cans over the past couple of years. That's insane. That's absolutely insane. And I recycle them. Anyway, my point is that, and that's such a small thing to ask people to do. Recycling aluminum saves 95% of the energy. All these people worried about carbon emissions. Hey, quit taking bauxite and making new aluminum when you don't have to. Recycle aluminum. You save 95% of the energy just by recycling aluminum cans. And people just toss them out the window. So my point with all of that is that my frustration, Duncan, is that, and I appreciate where you're going with this for human rights, for generational. It's got to be instilled, inculcated in people so that it becomes generational. But we somehow seem to lose some of these things. You and I were talking earlier about how formal English was a century ago and how we've kind of lost that. And hopefully it'll come back. And the same thing with this. A lot of the movement that your generation and then myself and others like myself who were kids growing up, youth and teenagers, got behind this thing, whether they were environmentalists or they were conservationists or just caring humans, it seems to have fallen by the wayside when it comes to taking care of our environment. And I worry the same thing happens in human rights because political actors have to be the ones to enforce it. And if they're malfeasant, we get what we see around the world. That's a concern for me. Do you think it's a valid concern?
Well, in the preamble, there is a very telling line, and I should have it, but I'm going to have to paraphrase it. But what it says is that something about people subjected to tyranny having to resort to rebellion. And without treading on ice that's too thin, what we are seeing with the truckers' convoy in Canada, and now in the United States, and now actually also in the UK, and the millions of voices that have been raised around the world, is that you can push people so far.
Only so far.
Yeah.
Well, I'd have to agree with that. It's interesting because this response, I'll call it an allergic response to the events of the past 29 months. Let's just leave it at that. But the allergic response to this, people have been largely acquiescent, and they've acquiesced to this. They've been compliant in many cases, despite misleading or factually incorrect information given by authorities the world over about what's happening and not happening. And people simply, for perceived safety and protection, surrender without even thinking about their rights, without even questioning it. I have all along questioned it without putting myself in jeopardy of losing my platform over that topic. And I've pointed out that when leaders have been wrong, when they've lied to us about different things. And it's frustrating because, with the exception of Australia, which that reaction has been going for a long time, maybe because in Australia and Canberra, the authorities, and particularly in Victoria and New South Wales, have been particularly draconian about their measures. and their claims of success. Maybe that's why Australians responded so quickly against this. But the Australians have been in the forefront of this for a long time, despite the fact that the media's covered it up. 600,000 people show up at rally in Melbourne. I have the footage of it. One of my viewers was there. We live streamed the event, so I covered that event. 600,000 people in Melbourne. I mean, that city only has 5 million people. So 600,000 people showing up in the largest city in Australia for
it's over 10%.
Exactly, and that's every weekend. It went on for months. Now, we saw nothing in Canada, virtually no protests except for a Polish immigrant who is a pastor, Arthur Pawlowski, who because a very famous viral video, which the police entered his house of worship without a warrant, or without reasonable suspicion. They walked in and he told them to get out. You're Nazis! Get out of here! I left each of your feet! Get out of here! And we were off on them. And of course, they embarrassed the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And so he's become, target number one in the strike against us. But we see stupid things like where the authorities impose rules, they don't follow them. Bojo in the United Kingdom. We see the Christmas party. We see it in South Africa where members of government host parties. They run around flagrantly violating the rules they put in place for everybody else. But the reaction was not very strong. But now, 2 years plus into this, we're starting to reach a crescendo, I think, where people are pushing back. The truckers' rally in Canada, I think, despite the fact they're trying to demonize it and lie about what it is and what it isn't, may be where the bow begins to break. I don't know if that's the case, but I mean, we have compulsory jabs in Austria, or you can pay 5,000 euros, fine for not being jabbed. It's pretty scary here. We have seen lots of worldwide rallies, which were not covered by the press, in London, in Berlin, in Amsterdam, all over Italy, and places like that. But we haven't seen them in the States. They've just started kicking off here in the States of late. We've seen them in some, because, the States is a bit different. We have a federal government. In theory, it's supposed to be a lot weaker than it is. In practice, it's pretty strong. But the states are sovereign, and a lot of rights revert to them. And so different states had different thresholds and requirements. So, for instance, when I leave here and go to an event in Virginia, which I did to cover a presser for the rugby season opening up for the DC team, they did it in Virginia. I drove from Pennsylvania, no requirement to wear facial covering. Went into Maryland, required to wear facial covering to walk into a building. I drove through Maryland, went to Virginia. All of this is, an hour apart because they're so close, these states. And went to Virginia, no requirement for facial covering. So when I came back, I couldn't stop in Maryland and get something to eat because I couldn't sit in the restaurant, But the point is that this pushback is finally coming on this topic, since we've kind of brought it up here. It's a little bit frightening. Hey, folks, you're listening to Chris White Africa on the Indaba Africa channel, part of the Indaba Broadcasting Network. Today's special feature guest is Lord Duncan McNair, a former member of the British House of Lords and a tireless campaigner for human rights, the founder of protecting, misspoke there.
Peaceful Planet.
Peaceful Planet.
Peaceful Planet.
Peaceful Planet. There's the pitch for it. Yeah. You can find information about, if you'd like to learn more about Peaceful Planet, the links are below this video. And we're going to talk about that as soon as Duncan finishes responding to what I just said. You can find the links there. And also, if you're curious, you'd like to contribute, they're trying to raise money to raise awareness about human rights. There's a link to donate down there as well. Duncan, I just said a whole lot about a whole lot of things. Any responses, or can you remember what I just said?
Well, yeah, of course I can. The United States obviously is a very large country, and by virtue of being a federal, having a federal constitution, it provides an interesting series of contrasts, as you were suggesting, between the states. I can imagine that there might be a lot of people wanting to emigrate to Florida, where Ron DeSantis is holding the fort, holding the line. But before the environment became an issue in, say, the early 70s, my teenage years, my sort of older teenage years, were the years of the protest singers, of Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, some of the early Paul Simon and that kind of thing. Phil Oakes is a real hero of mine. I don't know if you ever heard any of his music, but he's well worth looking up on YouTube. The most searing experience or happening in my young life was the murder of Jack Kennedy.
Yes.
And I was, I think I was probably 16 or something like that when that happened. that was. I mean, obviously, it would be more traumatic for America, but it had reverberations all the way around the world. And some years later, in 1968, I just moved up to London, and I'm sitting in my bedsit listening to the radio, and I think, my God, they're replaying the murder of Jack Kennedy, and then to my increased and absolute horror, I found that what they were actually talking about was the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. So without getting too controversial, I have to say that it is my hope that that the result of all this is that we get the sort of world that Jack Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy wanted to create for the people of America and the people of the world.
No, it's a fair point, and the vision. Well, not just that, but also Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. His
Absolutely.
yeah. I mean, you didn't neglect him, but I just throw him in there because
yeah, sure.
It's fascinating for me because growing up, it's interesting because I run into people all the time, especially Americans, a lot of Americans, white liberal Americans, and a lot of Black Americans, and they're quite astounded that I would know something about Black history. And I was years ago. I took this. We have this examination program called the College Level Examination Program, CLEP. And it's for non-traditional students. Now, I had gone to university at 17 and after a year decided that I should come back when I'm prepared and ready to actually make a contribution, learn something, and stop wasting other people's money. And so I joined the military to get money to go to school and get some life experience and come back. And while I was in the military, I took one of these CLEP tests. The Education Center provides that. And if you reach a certain score, you get college credit. So you get semester hours or quarter hours, and that's a course you won't have to take. And one of the tests was African American history. And I said, well, I'll do this. So I took the African American history. And of course, this is the days before the internet. So you have to wait in the mail for the letter to come with your score sheet and all that. It takes weeks later. So a few weeks later, after an exercise we had, a military training exercise, I go down the Education Center to collect my results. And I come back to the motor pool. And the unit that I was in was a signal unit. And it was about 1/3 whites, Anglo-Saxons, 1/3 Hispanic, and 1/3 Black. And hey, Wyatt, how'd you do? And I'm like, well, here you go, man. I got I forget the score. It was something like 80 points was the max. And I got like 78, which is astounding. And I said, I got like 78, 80. They gave me 3 semester hours, which was the max. You could get 1, 2, or 3, depending on your score. And like, man, how do you know so much about African American history? I'm like, because it's American history. It's American history. Why wouldn't you know about these sort of things? It just astounds me that people don't really focus on the bigger picture here. And when it comes to all these different topics. So I got a little bit off track where I was going with that, but I don't know why I want to tell that story. But anyway, I just thought I'd share that one. But it is interesting that we do live in I think some crazy times. I want to say democratization of information. I think maybe that's the right phrase to use. The ubiquitous information. Somebody can just grab their mobile right now and do a search for Duncan McNair. Who is this oak? And find all kinds of pages about you from the British government, from other places, from also from Peaceful Planet to learn a little bit about you. But that wasn't possible 30 years ago. You couldn't do that. You'd have to go to a library and hopefully they have something, or go through microfilm to find things. But those things are at your fingertips. But while useful information like that is available at your fingertips, so is garbage, hatred, bile, and idiocy and fake
Absolutely.
stuff. And the democratization of information is a dual-edged sword. It has made a major impact in eroding the sovereignty of states, which can be good, but oftentimes can be bad. But it has also led to a widespread misuse of information by people. And I think a lot of people don't really. One of my concerns about society, and I see this play out here in America, and I've also seen it elsewhere, like in Africa, where rote memorization is typically the way kids are taught in primary and secondary school, not critical thinking. You're not taught how to think. I think we're losing that in America. I can see it from the emotional responses and the lack of intellectual depth when people respond to issues. there's not critical thinking. If I can go to rural Appalachia and attend 38 different elementary and junior high schools, moving every couple of weeks around the country, every couple of months, and being the new kid and adjusting and having to relearn things or being behind because they're learning things I haven't learned, if I can manage to do that and become functionally literate and be a critical thinker, I think we can teach our progeny critical thinking. But right now, I'm very concerned. There is a pervasive lack of critical thinking the globe over, whatever the topic is, whether it's the Rona or it's human rights or it's the environment or it's sovereignty or it's just, popular culture. It's really crazy. And this is a dual-edged sword, and it concerns me. Not from a standpoint that I think it's bad, but from a standpoint that people don't understand how to use it properly.
Well, I've got a very interesting point on that.
Sure.
And well, two things really. One is that I'm just beginning to get into social media for Peaceful Planet because I need to. And it's yes, I was in at the beginning with the environment, but
you're in at the end with social media.
Yeah, exactly. No, I've gone and
no, you had a useful thing from the experience with social media because you've just moved into it.
Yes. Now, I was introduced to an Irish gentleman called Diarmaid Hudna. Now, he had a finance background and he's interested in tech and that kind of thing. But he wrote a book about a positive social media experiment or initiative. And then people would come to him and say, well, where is it? So he thought, oh, well, I suppose I better create it. Now, if you look up cybersmarties.com, and he's a wonderful guy and it's a wonderful program, and I'm very happy to give him a free plug. What they have, so in Ireland, 89,000 kids are using this positive training in the, training in the positive use of social media. And this is expanding around the world through other people that I've introduced him to. But it is monitored electronically. Certain posts will trigger, but also monitored by humans. And the aim is to coach children into positivity. And what they found, they've been awarded by the Irish police and also by UNICEF. And what they found is that cyberbullying among the group has virtually sort of shriveled away to zero. But what they've done is to make it so that it's only for kids between 7 and 12, and you can only join through the school register. So what that does is it excludes creeps who pose as young kids to be able to groom them and all that kind of thing. And it is an initiative which is expanding in India and the Middle East and in South Central Los Angeles. I think in time that Diarmaid should be a candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize because it is a terrific initiative. I didn't get a chance to share the link with him, but I will tell him that I've done it and send him a copy of the link to the video.
Well, I appreciate that, but you've also opened a door for me there. I just, while you were explaining that, I unlike Microsoft, I can actually multitask. I was listening to you share that and looking at the website simultaneously, and I think that this is a guest I'd like to get on my program to talk about that. That's a critical skill, a critical important thing, and I like the approach that they're dealing with that age, not just from a standpoint of creeps trying to get in on children, but that is the stage when kids move to these devices and tablets and PCs, and their brain is developing. They haven't got to where they've learned critical thinking yet. They're just being introduced to it. They're becoming literate. And this is a critical time to teach them the rules of the road, so to speak, which I think is what this is all about. It sounds like, and I'd love to interview him. We'll have to get him on.
Okay, well, I'll certainly be in touch with him. And our equivalent age level course, I'm abysmally prepared for this, Chris, but I mean, you're very welcome to share the little booklet
Okay,
on the
we'll
website
we'll do that.
with people.
And
Yeah.
actually, this is a good segue. Let's talk about Peaceful Planet. And so now the courses you're talking about, you can get that. You don't have to answer this directly, but get to it in the course of your response. The courses you're talking about, we're talking about in Farsi, which of course for people that aren't familiar, that's a language spoken in Persia or Iran, primarily, but also on the sprinklings on the border margins there. But it's spoken there, and also in, I think you said Urdu and some other languages. But these courses, are they intended eventually or now even for people for kids and people the world over to learn about this? And okay, so let's segue into Peaceful Planet. Tell us a little bit about that and what prompted it, what got you into this. Obviously we've talked a lot about your background, your grandfather's background, and this drive to assure and inform about human rights, but this obviously came about, you've created this as a founder of this organization. Let's talk a little bit about Peaceful Planet.
Well, I mean, basically, Peaceful Planet has one goal, and that is to bring into reality the original purpose of the people who signed the Universal Declaration. And in terms of generational change, when you look at the primary elementary school booklet, we're presenting the human rights in 7-year-old terms. For example, the right to, if I remember rightly, the right to property. It's a little scene, a little cartoon on the beach with Dad on his on his towel, telling the little girl, "No, that is Joe's spade. You have to let him have it." And sharing things, somebody's sharing their, you have the right to property. No, that was a different one. Anyway, have a look at them, because they're presenting the 30 human rights in a digestible form for that age group. And the Youth for Human Rights course has a little video clip for every human right, and then the course that I wrote, the post-secondary course, I actually found that the BBC had done an operation, a whole series of programs in about 2002. They'd sent this is actually, what's it called? World Radio. Anyway, they'd sent their foreign correspondents the task of finding a story that related to one of the 30 human rights. And then there was a write-up on that and some pictures and so on. So I've used a lot of those. I did actually write to the BBC and said, is it okay if I do this? And I didn't get a reply, so I assumed it was. And but I've just brought together lots and lots, not only violations, but for example, when you get my approach to the whole Universal Declaration is to divide it into chunks. So what I've done is I've kind of zoomed out from the 30 articles, so that what you've got is the first chunk is the first chunk is the preamble, the introduction, but the first chunk of the rights is the personal safety rights. And the second chunk is the legal protection rights. And it goes on. But you get to Articles 22 to 27, and you've got what I call the social needs and development rights. Now, these are a bit controversial because not all countries can actually provide the sort of social security system that you get in America and Europe and other developed economies.
Sure.
So how do you do this? It does actually say within the resources of the country, but actually, if you look at it, there are traditional structures in place that create, to a degree, certain levels of social security. And also, there's a very important point that traditional societies tend to have more cohesive families. And so the fragmentation and the isolation and the individuation that you get in Western cultures and communities actually mean that we have to spend more on social security because we got far more people living on their own than, for example, there are in Bangladesh or Rwanda or whatever, where
Sure.
you have tribes and families and
extended families where people are taken care of and part of the family.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there could be a lot of work done on how to include people in society, and not just because they're a different color or whatever.
Sure.
But you see, if you think about it from the point of view of the Golden Rule and the common humanity of people, I see actually that we're going in the direction of a more gentle world.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be a more caring world and a more inclusive world. Now, if you're in Yemen at the moment, it might be very difficult to envisage that.
Oh, indeed. Well, it's so sad.
But you see, when we started out with, even before I'd actually thought of the name Peaceful Planet, I started with the Farsi speakers. And the first thing that I realized was the lady who'd asked me to come and talk about democracy as well as what my grandfather had done said the Iranian opposition is very fragmented. And so there are Kurdish speakers, a Kurdish minority, there's an Azeri minority, there's an Arabic minority, there are all the concerns about the politics and the treatment of women and so on. And it actually got quite heated at times. And I realized that whatever you focus on in life, you're going to get more of. And so if you focus on problems, and sometimes it seemed like a dialogue of the deaf. People were shouting the odds, trying to make their voices heard for their issue. And then what I realized is that if you focus on the solution, at least you've got a chance of moving in the direction of a solution, and that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the solution.
Oh, that's well put.
To all of these problems.
That's well put. And I agree with you. It's for me on my program today, we're talking about solutions, which is something I like to do. It's a bit frustrating for me because as a military person, it's always about solution resolution. You're building towards something, ultimate goal. You're trying to achieve something, and the misfortunes, mishappenings, and things that come along, you deal with them, you mitigate them, but they're not the focus of what you're doing. You're ready for it. Now, in what I've been doing since I left active service and doing these broadcasts and reporting on the news, sadly, it's difficult to find good news to report on. So oftentimes you find yourself not talking about solutions. So I'm grateful that we're talking today about the idea for solutions. Now with Peaceful Planet, it almost sounds, and I want to make sure that we get this correct for the entire audience, it almost sounds, you obviously got programs oriented on children, but you also do programs that are intended for adults to inculcate the right approach.
Well, yes. My focus on children is based on what I'm calling generational change, and obviously, as you were saying about how my generation stimulated your generation to be conservationists and environmentalists and so on. So the same process with human rights. Ultimately, I think that people will see that there is another way of doing things. And certainly, you did have a president who actually made peace in a number of very important theaters. I won't pursue that, but you know what I'm talking about.
Are we talking about Voldemort, our recent president?
Sorry?
No, I'm just joking. I got censored for covering an event. A former president spoke recently, and I actually censored his speech because he kept complaining about events of 2020 and then disavowed his claims. And even though I follow the rules at YouTube, they censored me for a week. So I now call him Voldemort. That's what I call him.
Yes. Well, yes, indeed, Voldemort. Yes, and what we need is a Harry Potter.
There you go. There you go. Absolutely. No doubt about that. Well, this Peaceful Planet sounds like a very interesting effort to make a difference in the world. Folks, if you're interested in it, there's a link right below the video. If you're just tuning in, check out the link, go to the site, learn what you can about it. If you got questions, you can send them to me, and if I can answer them, I'll try. If not, I'll pass them along. But I think there's a contact there for you. You can also ask them from there. And
certainly, Chris. If anybody has any Peaceful Planet questions, they're very, very welcome to contact either of us. And I'm not sure whether you've got a link below to my donate page, but certainly
I do have that below. There's a link to the donate if people want to donate. What I didn't include is your mobile number, because I didn't know if it was a personal mobile offhand or if it was one for the office, and I didn't want you to get inundated because you'd sent me some data, and that included email and a mobile number. That's not there, but if you want me to include that and give me permission, I will put that in the description so people can reach out. But I left it off for now.
Well, if I got hundreds of calls on it, then I'd probably get another personal one. So
we'll just leave it off for now. We'll just leave it off.
Leave it off.
People can find you on the website, or they can find Peaceful Planet there, and if they got questions, they can reach you that way.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. So, Lord Duncan McNair, I have the suspicion that you and I, because I think we kind of got robbed in London. We were too busy working, making that event happen, to actually get much chance to chat and talk about things. I suspected, based on our correspondence since then, that we probably would have spent hours talking about things. And we would have delved into the things where we disagree, because this has been mostly a conversation where we've pretty much agreed about things. And I suspect we could go on for another 4 hours, but I don't want to be a thief and take all your time. So I want to wrap up here sometime soon. So before we get to that, is there anything you'd like to bring up, or a topic we haven't discussed that maybe you think people should know about that's going on? Anything, and maybe some final words before we wrap up. The floor is yours. I'll put you on the screen, just you. It's your chance to share any thoughts with you. And right now, you've got to sit back a little bit. There you go, because we lost your chin again. There we go. We got you.
Okay. All right. Well, my purpose is, as I said, to bring the knowledge of the actual human rights to the people of the world. And so the more languages I have, the courses translated into. I do have Google Translate as an option on the menu, but it's a bit limited, so any country that is very keen to have Peaceful Planet help them with human rights education is very welcome to get in touch with me. And if they would like to translate the courses into their language, we'll put them on the website, and I can help them to organize a program.
Well, that sounds excellent. Just a quick question when it comes to the languages there. Have you got anybody working on translating that into South Yorkshire language so those people understand it? For those,
well, I have a friend who's a very strong campaigner on current issues, called Mark Steele, and he has a Geordie accent. Now, a Geordie accent is from the northeast of England.
Yeah.
I mean, it's actually modified since he's been very much in the public eye. But at one event in London where he spoke, a Czech lady said to him that she would actually pay for him to have elocution lessons, so
so she could understand him.
So she could understand him. Yes.
No, I joke like that, and you've actually made it quite entertaining in response. But famously, the Yorkshire Strangler. Well, they lost the bubble, the police did, because they said that the suspect had a Geordie accent, and it turns out that wasn't the case at all, and it led them on a path looking for someone that was unrelated to the case, and it really a lot of women wound up dying as a consequence of that. But language is an important thing. We've talked about language here, and I'm just having a little fun with the people in the Midlands there with their accent. I mean, we've all got accents. I've got a Midwest accent, so and the way we allocute our words and enunciation makes a difference. At least most of what we say, we actually pronounce the words, unlike the French who swallow half of what they say. It's hard to follow what they're saying in their home language. But Lord Duncan McNair, I want to thank you for coming on today. It's a pleasure to get you on, and I really appreciate your quick response and desire to come on. And I'm going to invite you back on. You want to come back another time? We can talk about a specific project you're working on or this topic, and because we could have unpacked so many more things. I mentioned the International Court of Justice. You did. We didn't really get into talking about what it does. You mentioned it, but I want to talk more about that, as well as the responsibility to protect. These are all things that are focused on different rights between states and individuals. So thank you so much for your time, and have a lovely day. God bless. And I'm going to put you in the waiting room. If I guess you hang around for a second, it'll take me about a minute to wrap up the stream. I just want to chat with you very quickly. Just stay on the line, okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so folks.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. Thank you. It's been great talking to you, and I look forward to the next time.
Brilliant. Folks, Lord Duncan McNair, pleasure having me on the program. I hope you've enjoyed the stream. Let me go ahead and send him into the waiting room, and then I will go ahead and wrap up the stream here for everybody else. Okay. All right, folks, thanks for tuning in today. I really do appreciate you being here. Thank you so much. I hope that this was informative. And I want to thank Duncan McNair for pointing out my youth. I do appreciate that. That was kind of him. Anyway, folks, please pass the word, spread it around, let people know, help us overcome shadow banning. I mean, you see the kind of content that I bring, the guests that I bring to the conversation. I mean, this is just reasonable, cogent discourse that needs to happen. And, you know, when you get censored by tech titans because they disagree with you, it's really sad. Now, we talked around two topics, the Rona, and we talked around the Freedom Rally 2022 just to avoid any controversy. But those two topics we should have been able to freely discuss here. And I think we would have found instances in which Duncan McNair and I disagreed on a few points, but we agreed on a lot of things if we got into that. So thank you all so much. I'll look at doing a Night Owls today just to follow up, also maybe bring you a little bit of the news around the world. Also, stay tuned. I recorded a video just before this stream in which I took footage from AfriForum and the court case taking place at the South Gauteng High Court today. Started yesterday. Outside the court today, there were economic freedom fighter members outside shouting, chanting, yelling, and singing the song Kill the Boer. I've done a video about that. Look for that video coming out here in the next hour or so. If you don't get notified, be sure to become a subscriber to the Telegram announcements group. It costs you nothing. The reason I use Telegram is if you want to hide your mobile number, you can have your anonymity. People don't know what your mobile number is. That way you're not being inundated with people calling you. That's why it's on Telegram. But apparently some people are stubborn. They don't want to get in there. The Telegram announcements group, only I control it. Only I contribute to it. You will not get any spam, no crypto, no harassments from anyone. If you choose to hide your phone number and give yourself a username, you can do that. That's your prerogative. So please join the Telegram announcements group. If one of my mods could put that up, I'd be grateful. And then you'll never miss any of my videos. By the way, folks, I've submitted my press credentials for CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Committee annual meeting that takes place this year in Orlando. That's end of February. I'm waiting for them to be approved. If they're approved, I'll be traveling to Orlando, and I'll be participating in that, interviewing major political figures from the conservative movement around the country during that event. So more coverage on that. Thanks a lot, folks. Thanks to my guest, Lord Duncan McNair. Appreciate his insights and his contributions to this program. And we'll have him back on sometime, folks. Thanks a lot. God bless. Have a lovely day. And that's it here from Central Pennsylvania. We'll catch you on Night Owls a little bit later on. And don't forget to catch my upcoming video on the AfriForum court case against the economic freedom fighters and Julius Malema. Cheers, everyone. Be safe out there.